Well, thank everyone for coming. This is part of a continuing tradition that Richard and I started, I believe, 10 years ago, Richard. We were talking once about how we could make visiting writers and lectures, programs, in a way more interesting for them. I had this observation that, I'm sure Dan Barry here has lectured in who knows how many college lecture halls. You forget them all.
So many.
And so the idea was to take advantage of this unique space, a space they would remember to take advantage of the incredible creative energy and hospitality of our host, Richard, and his lovely wife, Colette, and just simply feed on this unique artistic space. And I think it's worked. It's been very successful. So today we're going to turn to a discussion of Dan Barry's, actually sixth book. Is that right, Dan?
Only five.
Five. I counted. Or his fifth book, This Land, which is an amazing series of reports, observations on America from 2007 to 2017. Dan is, by the way, on his third visit to campus. He has become a friend of St. John's and St. Ben's. And I've asked Lillian Arkenstein to give an introduction and background to Dan, and then from that we'll turn to the book itself. Lillian?
As Nick said, we are so excited to welcome Dan Barry here for his third. He's had a storied career, and we're excited to celebrate the and collection of stories. He's a graduate of St. Bonaventure University and New York University. His career started in Manchester, Connecticut as a reporter for the Journal-Enquirer, and then he moved to the Providence Journal-Bulletin. There he shared the Folk Award and the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting on organized crime. In 1995, he joined the New York Times. Here he wrote a column about New York, which evolved into the column, This Land. As Nick said, it started in 2007 and ran for a decade. The narratives that he wrote for this column, This Land, compiled a book with the same title that we are celebrating today. These stories are about the communities and the people that shape today's America. His writing has served as an inspiration for young journalists across the country, as well as other authors. Our very own Nick Hayes said he never would have written a book if it wasn't for Dan Barry's memoir, Pull Me Up. This relationship through writing and publishing has created a wonderful friendship, and we are so glad that it brought Dan Barry back to campus this fall. Please join me in welcoming Dan Barry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lillian. Let's start with the most obvious thing. If I understand your job correctly, Dan, you've traveled to all 50 states. You have a wide latitude of what you can write about just about anything. Your editor seems to support what would seem to be very esoteric, certainly non-political stories. I like my job here, by the way, and I often look around and think, how did I pull this off? How did you pull this job at the New York Times off? I mean, are there other openings? Anyway, be interested to share with us just how This Land column came to be, and before that, the About New York column that you wrote.
Well, the About New York column in the New York Times was very cherished real estate, and it goes back to the 40s, actually, to a great writer named Meyer Berger. And it might go back actually before that. I think it started perhaps in 1939, and then he was involved in World War II, and then he came back and they resurrected it again. And so there's been a long line of quite amazing journalists who occupied that real estate, including Bill Geist, who's Willie Geist's dad, and Anna Quinlan, and so Frank Kleins. So I was just glad to be there. What happened was it had gone dark for a few years, and after 9/11, I was quietly advocating for its resurrection, and I had a candidate in mind, me. And but at that time, the Metro editor was John Landman, and unbeknownst to me, the editor, Hal Raines, didn't like John Landman. John Landman didn't like Hal Raines, and so there was a standoff. And then there was the Jason Blair scandal that I actually wrote about, and Hal Raines soon departed. And then Landman approached the acting executive editor, Joe Lelyveld, who had been the editor and was actually serving as an interim editor. And he said, yeah, you can start it up again and let Barry have it, but don't make a big deal out of it, because I don't want to make that decision for the executive editor who would be more permanent than he was. He was actually just kind of holding the seat. And so it just appeared. No announcement, just about New York after a while. So I did that for 3 or 4 years, and I got wanderlust. Imagine writing about New York City twice a week, about anything you want. It was really a dream job. But then Hurricane Katrina occurred, and I really felt the need to bear witness somehow. I needed to get down there. I'd never been to New Orleans in any meaningful way. I'd been there a couple of days once. And from that experience, and I think I mentioned it in the foreword, the signal event was driving through downtown New Orleans with the photographer Nicole Bengevino and seeing what appeared to be a body in the middle of Union Street. And it was covered with a tarp, and the legs were raised in rigor mortis, and there was a traffic cone at the head. And I got out of the car and walked over to this and came back to the car and said to Nicole, that's a body. And there was kind of like a disconnect, if you think about it, like, this shouldn't be happening. And then, as I recount in the foreword, we see 6 National Guardsmen walk up to the body, and we said, oh, okay, so now government's in charge, it's going to be taken care of, the body will be removed and taken care of properly. But instead, these guardsmen looked at the body. One guy took his camera out and took a photograph of it, and then they walked away. And then one guy turned back around and he blessed himself, and that was it. And so there was a curfew, so Nicole and I were really stunned. We had to get out of town. I said, no damn way will that body be there when we come back in the morning. It can't be. And we went all the way back to Baton Rouge, which is where we had to find a place to stay. And we came back in the morning. We went through all the various checkpoints that were in place at the time. We go back to Union Street, and it's about 90 degrees, and the body's still there. And that I began to write then. Nicole was driving, and I began to write with the lead about the body. And then everything else that I had experienced in a couple of days, or a few days actually, in New Orleans at this time, with the ending to this story open. By the time we would return, would the body still be there? And so I wrote the lead about a body in the middle of a street of a major American city in 2005. Then wrote about what else I had seen, all the various snapshots of a city in chaos, I think. There was no force of law anymore. People were driving the wrong way on one-way streets. People, looting buildings, and it was crazy. So we came back in the evening as dusk was settling, and yeah, the body was still there. So that was the ending to my story. I didn't know what the ending would be, but now the body's there. Well, that's the ending of my story. And it raised questions about where we were at that time and how the Bush administration was responding, if you recall. So, I always think about the Marines. we collect our dead. We don't leave anyone behind. Yet here in a street, in a major city, a body was being left there for several days. And in fact, when we saw the body, I saw a Louisiana state trooper, and I said, hey, not for nothing, but there's a body in the middle of the street. And he goes, oh yeah, I know. I put the traffic cone there so that the news trucks wouldn't run over it. So I wondered, whether the body would have been left there had it been that of a white man instead of a black man. So the corpse was that of a black man. Would we leave a body in the middle of a street? And this was a dry part of New Orleans, and New Orleans obviously got flooded terribly, but not here. And the story was on the front page the next day, and by 9 o'clock in the morning, the body was removed. So that and other experiences in New Orleans and along the Gulf Coast spurred the idea of trying to do an About New York column for the entire country. It's absurd, if you think about it. I mean, New York is a stipulated sense of place and everything. Let's do a column a week from around the country and moving around. But, I said, well, let's give it a shot.
Has anybody ever compared you to Charles Perrault?
Charles Perrault? Yeah, that's been mentioned, though. If you know, he had a mistress in his camper.
Dad, I was kind of
so
wondering how I would avoid any reference to that.
I kind of, my wife doesn't like that analogy, but, no, I was traveling most of the time with Angel Franco, who was like 250 pounds, and, he wouldn't take kindly to that comparison. But, yeah, so that's how the This Land column began. So.
Well, I must confess, I've been a fan of your columns in the New York Times for a long time, and when I first started explaining to my friends, what your assignment was in that, I did make that comparison until I learned more about Mr. Perrault, and I stopped it. But you're covering these stories during the time of Bush the Younger, Obama, and the first years of Trump. These are exceptionally political times. Yet, although there certainly are political themes that I think we'll take up in a few minutes in your bylines, you're remarkably apolitical. That is, you don't seem to zero in on a particular political issue or policy issue. Is that correct? And how do you balance being a journalist of integrity in this highly politicized time?
Well, I don't know if I describe myself as apolitical. So first, I did mention all along I was quite aware of how lucky I was, and I think that I joked about this in a class earlier today that the New York Times thought it was worth it to have me out of the office. They just assumed not see me, so it was worth the flight and the rental of the car. In terms of being apolitical, so again, in newspaper world, you'll find this kind of funny, but first there's the op-ed section. That's where Gail Collins resides, and Brett Stevens, I don't know if you've heard of him, and Maureen Dowd, and they reside over there. So those are their opinion. My column was appearing in the news pages, which meant that I was allowed a point of view, but it wasn't supposed to be an opinion piece. It was a reported out piece, and I was allowed to convey what I was thinking about it in a subtle way. But I couldn't say, Bush screwed up here or Obama's wrong there. Also, the funny thing about newspapers, at least in the print version, the way that newspapers would signal this to the reader that, okay, this is an opinion or a point of view piece of reportage rather than a straight news story, is that they would call the columns would have a ragged right feeling. So normally a newspaper column would be straight and mostly uniform, but if it had a point of view, it would have a ragged right. In other words, it wasn't even. I've always wondered how many readers said, "Oh, look at that ragged right. This must be a subjective piece of journalism." So I think, Nick, that I was allowed a point of view. So if you read some of the pieces in the book, let's say, for example, the day of Obama's inauguration, how do you write about that in a fresh way? I don't know if I did, but what I thought was, well, this guy now will be controlling the lives of all those in the military. So why don't I go to a middle school at a military, near a military base, and watch the inauguration with these children? You know, that's the moment. Mm-hmm. You know, so I went to Fort Riley near Junction City, Kansas, and sat and in an auditorium, watched, you know, a bunch of kids watch our new president on a television screen. And so, is that apolitical? Yeah, in one sense. But in another sense, it's saying that this person, you know, this is reinforcing the notion that this person now has the fates of many, many people in his hands, including these children whose mothers and fathers can be sent based on his decisions. Another one that I wrote was an execution in Tennessee. I had I don't know if it's a privilege, but I had the opportunity to witness an execution of a man who did a horrible thing. He effectively killed all his children. That would suggest to me that he has mental illness flat out, but the state of Tennessee didn't see it that way. And so his crime had occurred so long ago that he was allowed to choose the means of capital punishment that were available at the time of his crime, and that meant that the electric chair was available to him, and he chose the electric chair. So I witnessed this guy as he was escorted to the electric chair in you know, it was like a little screening room. So there were maybe like 12 or 14 chairs, and then there's a curtain, and you sit there. It's well after midnight. There's tons of people outside voicing pro and against capital punishment, and a bunch of news cameras, and I'm in there with a couple of other reporters. There were no family members anywhere, and then the screen opens like this. It's like a play. The screen opens, and there's Darrell Holton sitting strapped to a chair. Now, I had met him a week earlier. I thought it behooved me to meet the guy whose death I was about to witness, and so I got to know him a little bit. And when I had met him, his head was shaved, and now it was even somehow shaved even more. What struck me was, and so what do you do with that situation if you're going to write about it? Now you can turn it into all sorts of melodrama. You can embroider the moment. I mean, is there any more serious moment than the taking of someone's life at the order of the state? That's a somber moment, and so I will tell you. I said this to Nick earlier at lunch that at moments it was almost biblical, because a corrections official had to take a sponge and squeeze it over the guy's head to improve the conductivity, and he also got on his knees and he did it at his ankles, right? And so to me, that, being the screwed up Catholic I am, I see this stuff and everything. It's the washing the feet to me. The guy's on his knees. Then they attached the equipment. And I had gotten the manual, how do you properly electrocute a man? It was this thick with every detail down to the most minute detail was all codified, and they were following it step by step. And then, it's just like in the Warner Brothers movies. The lights flicker a little bit. He gets electrocuted. The curtains shut, and quickly, and you wait a few minutes because now they're checking, and then a disembodied voice says, ladies and gentlemen, Darrell Holton was declared dead at 1:25 a.m., whatever. Please exit. That's it. So now I have to go and write this. I wrote it flat, straight. No embroidered, just this is what happened. But I dare you to read it and not know where I stood on the matter of capital punishment. So am I being apolitical? I guess so. Maybe I'm allowed some kind of point of view, and it's in there.
I shared this with you earlier, Dan. To me, particularly that article is an example of how you can be political when you can't be political. Meaning you don't directly condemn the capital punishment in this piece, but sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, the absolute horror of the details is what overcame me as I read it. Do you think, is it possible your column might have lent support to the movement against capital punishment in the country?
I don't know. I don't know.
Would that have been part of your intention?
I wouldn't feel bad if it did, I think that, you could argue that I'm being political in a sense, small lowercase p, in what I'm hoping to do, which is to hold up a mirror to the American society and say, this is who we are, and reflect upon it. Okay, so the state of Tennessee killed a man. Okay, but if you know that, theoretically fine, but if you are basically brought face to face with that moment through words, however well I do it, it's a mirror. It's an avenue to reflect upon who we are as a people and how we behave and treat one another.
Okay, let me turn to one of the columns that, on the surface, I would have thought would have been the most political or the most partisan, and it is not. It's a remarkable portrait of the presidential election night, seen from the viewpoint of two venues in Manhattan that are separated by only a Manhattan mile, I believe you put it. I found it to be a fascinating article, the way you had both, the Trump supporters out celebrating and your key figure, the gentleman that has the kind of little restaurant deli.
Right. You know what that was? That was a craven attempt to be a part of election night. That really, they had so many people assigned to so many stories, and I'm the guy who wanders around the country. He's back in the newsroom. Too bad. And so I just went up to someone. I said, what if I just did something here in Manhattan? Both of the celebrations or funerals are here. One's going to be a wake, one's going to be a wedding, right? So why don't we try and capture that, a New York moment as this is happening? So the Clinton operation is at the Javits Center on the far west side of Manhattan, and then Trump was it wasn't a Trump hotel. I think it was the Hilton, but it was on Fifth Avenue. It may have been Sixth Avenue. And so I spent a lot of time mapping. I drew a line. We measured it. I went to the researchers and we located where the center was. I had the whole history of that little block, like going back 100 years, because that might be material for the column about saying who we are, where, the past and the present, whatever. And it happened to have been this very small Mexican restaurant, which became of the moment, given what candidate Trump had been saying about immigrants. And so you stop there, and I had dinner there, and I talked to the guy. He's working his ass off, He's got 2 kids. One's a lawyer. I think the other one is going to be a lawyer. And, these are the people that Trump at that time was, maligning. Okay, well, President Trump, this is who you represent now. That's how it wound up.
One more politically connected question. I was very touched by your story of a young teenage woman, a teenage soldier's goodbyes on her last day before she was entering into the service. I could not help, Dan, but read that as a critique of a government that would send an 18-year-old girl off to combat, that would behave recklessly. My sense of her life being fragile and in jeopardy. Am I reading too much into the byline?
No, I want you to read as much as you can into what I write. But the backstory of that column was, it reflects how crazy the process of writing these. I used to write them once a week, and I would be aware of being in a different part of the country. I didn't want to always be in New England because it was a little more convenient to me, or just in Pennsylvania. So if I did something from Pennsylvania, I would force myself to find something in Florida or in the upper Midwest or the Pacific Northwest or somewhere else. And then also to change the tone of it. I didn't always want them to be, sad or poignant. I wanted them sometimes to be funny or lighter, or just reflections of who we are and about people who aren't normally in the news. I didn't want to go and do an interview of an elected official. And so I had just come back from someplace. I had no idea where to go. And on a Saturday, I visited Arizona and New Mexico and Southern California virtually, going online and looking at local newspapers. And when I would do that, I wouldn't look at the front pages so much. I would look at the news briefs and the community news and just reflections of how we live our everyday life. And there was a little item saying, at the American Legion, this motorcycle group is going to have breakfast with Risha Kane, who is joining the Army, and then escort her most of the way to Las Vegas, where she would catch a flight to Fort Hood. So I called up Risha. I found her in the phone book, or her mother. I called up the motorcycle group. I called up the American Legion. They said, come on down, it's on a Tuesday. I called up the photographer, Angel Franco. You ready to go? So we go. And to me, there were other things going on. So Risha Kane is 18. If she was 5'2", I'd be surprised, okay? And the reason she was joining the Army was because the Army had agreed to pay $35,000 to her education, so there was incentive for her to join. And when I went to the family's modest house, they had one of those blown up checks that you see like at a lottery, lottery winner or something. And it was on the mantle of the house, and it said, to Risha Kane in huge letters, $30,000, U.S. paid for by the U.S. Army. I don't know what to make of that. Like, it is what it is, So, and to me, it's always poignant when someone goes off to service. It is a moment. She was, a couple of months earlier, she was at her senior prom. And she seemed so much younger than her age in many ways. And there's a famous photograph in that book. That photograph hangs in the newsroom. And what happened was they have the breakfast. Her father can't be there because he's working at an auto dealership. So imagine that. They're so strained economically that he can't be there for that moment. He has to work. So they have the breakfast. The motorcyclists, get ready to create this kind of like procession and lead her car, the car she's in, out of basically Needles, California, in the Mojave Valley, and then head up to Las Vegas. And then as it's pulling out, and Franco and I are following, it stops. And there's a guy leaning against a pickup truck, and it's her father. And they hug, and it's a great photograph. And then she goes on to Fort Hood. So is that against the war or for the war? I don't know. It's what we're doing, you know. And so if you think about what we are doing in terms of headlines and what we see out of Washington, that's one thing. But if you see how it trickles down to a moment outside of Needles, California, you know, it gives you a fuller knowledge of the impact of these decisions.
Let me maybe turn that conversation in a different direction for a few moments. It's difficult for me to define this precisely, how I sense it, but throughout your writing, I often sense a deep spirituality.
Oh boy.
Well, let's start with one you've already shared with me, your experience on Molokai, the Isle of the Lepers in Hawaii.
Mm-hmm. I don't mean to offend anyone, but I went to a Franciscan university. I'm not Jesuitically trained. So does everybody know Molokai and what that's about? You know, I just wanted to go there. That's all. I wanted to go there. I hadn't known about it, and I was pretty confident that I could tell a story from there. And the New York Times hadn't written about Molokai in a very long time. And so Franco and I went, and very quickly, this is where people with Hansen's disease, used to be known as leprosy, were basically dumped. Literally, the ships would pull up about 100 and 150 yards or so from the shore and basically tell the people with Hansen's disease to get out. And they would wade ashore, and they created a community, and nuns came to help, and Father Damien came to help, and a village developed, and people would live and die there. They would have children. You know, a community was formed. And so at some point, maybe in the late 50s, early 60s, someone said, you know what, this is screwed up. It's screwed up. And they stopped it. And the people who were living there were given the choice. While they were living there, they were not allowed to leave, okay? They could not go back to, say, Honolulu. Now they could, I think it was in the early 60s. But some people said, you know what? We like it here. This is who we are. This is our place. And so they remained. And so I went to visit some of them, including a husband and wife, and the husband's name was Boogie. And as an aside, after the column ran, Father Damien was inducted into the Hall of Saints. And Boogie and his wife and some other people from Molokai went to Rome and were there for that moment, which seems, you know, would have been unimaginable a half century earlier. But when I was there, I didn't feel this in almost any other place. There was a special place. I've often thought about it and haven't ever articulated it really. That it did seem spiritual to me. I guess, you know, because Damien is buried there, and it was just quiet. And you know, the winds come off the ocean, and you know, the rustling of the trees and the quiet and the realization of what had occurred on these grounds over the last century and a century, it would have been about a century, really moved me. And whether that was a religious moment or not, I mean, I just remember being quite humbled at that moment.
First, I'm going to change to an economic question, but in a
Segueing from religion to economics.
to jobs and labor. Actually, in your first section of the book, Change, you have a number of portraits of really the passing of blue-collar labor, I guess I might call it, or the old economic way of life. You have the portrait of Logan, West Virginia, and the few choices and options that remain for young people for anything other than the coal mines. You have a portrait from our own South St. Paul, the stockyards in the suburbs, about the end of the stockyards in South St. Paul. In Annie and Gloria, you have a beautiful portrait of a woman in the Fulton Fish Market. And my favorite of them all is the portrait of the elderly gentleman whose family for 3 generations, or at least 2 generations, had been selling Pontiacs.
Oh, yes.
And he cannot sell Pontiacs anymore. So what I'm suggesting is there's a beautiful sense of the loss of this way of life, the pride people took in all of it and things like this. But anybody ever accuse you of nostalgia?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't know if it's nostalgia. Nostalgia. There's I don't know how to describe it. It's. I feel as though what is it? The Willy Loman thought attention must be paid. Mm-hmm. So if a car dealership's selling Pontiacs for 2 or 3 generations, and they were fine cars and everything, and it's stopping, well, let's pause and at least acknowledge that. So, yeah, I get, and I was talking about mixing it up. I could have written the entire column for 10 years about things like that,
Mm-hmm.
things that are going away. I mean, in New York City, I don't know when the last time any of you were there, it's entirely different than when you were there. I don't care if it was 2 years ago. Things that were seen as sacrosanct and so much a part of the fabric of the city doesn't matter. It's all going away, and that's just the only constant is change in a place like a city and in a place like and in our consciousness. So, I like stories like that because I'm interested in them. They bring me back to some fuller understanding of where we were and what we cherished, and see it as applied to today. So, yeah, I'm a nostalgic guy.
I've been accused of that. Before I monopolize all of the conversation, I want to certainly invite, if anybody has questions they want to pose from the audience. Is there anybody who would like to volunteer? Jim?
I know one question is like, why do we invite this guy a 3rd time? Jesus.
I was curious, you write from a point of view. Is there any columns that you think about in particular that you think back and you wrote it at a particular time in a particular environment or political environment, and now when you look back you say, boy, if I wrote that article today, I'd write it from a really different point of view?
Probably, but I would have to think about that. I'd be a fool to say no, right? I would say probably yes, but not about the capital punishment. There's certain things that I would never change my feelings about. Probably, and I'd be glad to have someone point them out and ask if I feel the same way. Yeah.
Like you mentioned, you've been on this campus 3 times. You must have heard something about Benedict values somewhere along the way, I would think. One of them involves listening. Mm-hmm. I'd like to just hear what you have to say about listening, being a good listener.
That's a great observation. I didn't know that I was practicing Benedictine principles. Don't tell my Franciscan friends. But that's it, isn't it? That's it. When I go around the country, I have to dispel a lot of people of certain things, that I'm a East Coast wise ass who's just parachuting in representing an elitist institution, the New York Times, that comes from a particular point of view. And by the way, it's run by Jews, that kind of stuff. I have to overcome that stuff. And so, and unlike a lot of other reporters, almost all the people that I was interacting with were not elected officials. They had never spoken to a reporter, much less one from the New York Times. So, you know, you have to overcome the New York Times. You came all the way here. What are you up to? You know, that kind of stuff. So the trick first is to get to a point where I'm allowed to listen, right? To where someone feels comfortable enough to say something that I could hear. Do you know what I mean? And so I don't have any kind of tricks or anything. I present myself exactly as who I am, why I'm there. One trick might be, but it's part of my nature, I suppose, is being self-deprecating. You know, I'll make a joke at my own expense, or I'll see something on the wall of someone's house, and I'll make a connection because I am interested. You know, that's not a fake out. I am interested in your story. I want to know who you are, where you came from. And by the way, how absurd, it's only lately I've thought about this. How absurd is that a guy shows up in, you know, let's say, Upper Nebraska, and flies in, and immediately he's getting granular with someone he just met. That's what happens. If I were interviewing you, you and I have never met, I'll introduce myself. I'll try to put you at ease. I'm saying this because I want to convey to you that I actually care about what you want to tell me or who you are. And I will know within an hour who your parents were, where you came from, how did you make your money, what you care about. You'll know almost nothing about me except that I'm bald and I'm a little bit self-deprecating, whatever, you know, and I'm from the New York Times. So I'm always constantly aware of that imbalance, or I don't know if it's an imbalance, but that dynamic, right? But once we get there, listen. And some young reporters will have a series of questions. You know, all right, you know, what year were you born? What high school did you go to? And then the guy will say, well, you know what, I just killed 6 people. They're buried, they're in a closet over there. I said, wait, we're not there. You went to what college? No, you know, you can do that as a journalist. The trick is to have a series of questions in your head or written down, and go with the flow of the conversation and know when to let it ride. And often, and also, you know, it's interesting you talk about listening. It's also the power of silence sometimes, right? So if I'm interviewing, say, Rudy Giuliani, as I did years ago, you know, sometimes having someone say something and say nothing in response, right, makes you, the words begin to get heavier in the air, and you're trying to, like, they take on greater meaning, or they will need to be expanded upon by the Rudy Giulianis of the world. It's a great observation that I would say that's one of the single essential tools to know when not to talk and when just to listen, and to listen carefully and to listen beyond the words and listen to the silences, listen to the pauses. I did a column once at the beginning of the war about 2 members of the National Guard in Connecticut whose job was to notify family members. They were the ones who knock on the door, right? They're the ones who drive up in the car, the telltale car, they knock on the door and everything. And they were describing that experience to me, and this was early on in the war. And the conversation was winding to a close, and one of them was an insurance agent, and the other one, I think, was an executive assistant. It was a man and a woman. And so I'm sitting there with the man, and he's continuing. You know, he and I are having like chit chat, and she goes, and she's behind me, and she's fixing herself a cup of coffee, and I'm just listening to the guy, and he says, "Yeah, who knows? You know, we might get a call in an hour and have to go out and do it again." And I could see from the corner of my eye the woman's shoulders slump, and she said, "Oh God." like that. That's listening. Do you know what I mean? I rarely use a quote at the end of a column, you know. Oh God, that's how that column ended. Oh God, right? You know, I'm like, I try to be like this. Sometimes I try to be like this, and it's listening in many ways. You know, I notice everything, and I'm listening to everything, and I'm noticing the silences. You know, it's being in the moment with that person and paying that person the respect that he or she deserves. You know, and getting the story right. I will tell you. Then I don't mean to keep going on, but at the end of it, now I've talked to you, I have your story in this notebook, and I disappear. Like how do you feel about that? Like that's kind of weird, isn't it? So after I've written the story, I will call you up. Not all journalists do this, but I do it. I'll call you up and I will go over everything to make sure I have it accurate, and not only accurate, but contextually accurate. You may have said something, and I could use that quotation in the story, and it would make you look like a fool because I've taken it out of context. So I'm always aware of the gift that you've given me, because you've given me the gift of your story, and it's precious and it's fragile, and I have to treat it as such, and so I'm very aware of that.
Louis.
I so glad you asked that question, because since I had the other side, which was, do you ever get the sense that the people who are your readers are the ones you are actually thinking about when you're writing? So, you know, it's appearing in the New York Times. I'm looking around this room at the people who are in this room. We're the kind of people who maybe read the New York Times. Are the people you really want to read it? Are you getting any feedback from people who are like, oh yeah, I read this in the Alexandria Echo Press?
I do, yeah. And also on Facebook. People will, you know, I wrote a story recently about a friend of mine who died of cancer, and as she was dying, her hospice bed was on one side of her apartment, and we were gathered on the other side of the apartment for kind of a farewell. And a man walked in, and he was carrying a black case, and he laid it down, and he took out a Stradivarius. And then someone said, "That's Joshua Bell." And he had been invited by a friend of my friend who was dying. And he went into her room, and he said, "Hi, I'm Josh Bell, and I'd like to play you some music." And someone was in the room with a cell phone, and they recorded this moment of him at the foot of this woman's bed, and he played a beautiful piece by Massenet. And so I wrote about that and went all over the place through Facebook and other means. So I do, you're right. Is it only New York Times readers, you know? It's the same thing as like Fox News. Are we living in our own silos and getting our viewpoints reinforced over and over again without any counterpoints? But these days, the stories are shared in so many different ways you can't imagine. Twitter, Facebook in particular. Facebook way more than Twitter. So.
Further questions out there? Jim?
Yeah. One of the last chapters is on 9/11.
Yeah.
One of the things that really struck me is sitting in a pottery studio, it's a physical art form. So many of the people that would grab something nearby and put it in their pocket, it was just sort of a natural reaction. Or the fire department in Seattle that would get a girder or something.
Yeah.
There's sort of a physicalness of this. And I'm just
Relics.
Pardon me?
Relics.
Relics, right. I'm just kind of curious, since you live in the New York area, can you give us some sort of a feel for I'm not sure if freshness is the right word, but how present 9/11 still is here in 2019 in that neck of the woods?
You know, it's never gone away. You know, it never goes away. I spent so much time writing about that and revisiting that day and the after effects of that day. but I haven't spent any time at the museum that opened up a couple of years ago. And maybe I should go, but I do feel like, what else can you tell me? I was so immersed in it, I don't know if I can go. I don't know how I would react. I have my own relics at home, you know, that because I was down at the site when it was a pile and everything. I talked about that earlier. It's very fresh, and one of the columns in the collection was actually in Shanksville. Have any of you been there? So, you know, the collapse of the towers, you know, was so dominant that you sometimes have to say, oh yeah, Shanksville and the Pentagon, right? There was 3 incidents, and so I had never been to Shanksville, so I decided to go about a month before 9/11 a couple of years ago. And I had no idea what the story was. And that's a horrible feeling, going to a place and trying to justify the expense without knowing exactly what it is. You just have a general idea that you want to write about Shanksville. So a great photographer named Todd Heisler and I go, and we're wandering around trying to figure out, what is the story here? Is it about the merchandise in the gift shop of this place? It's a National Park Service operation. Like, who would wear a T-shirt about Flight 93? But if someone did, what would that mean? And would I pass judgment on that? Who knows? You know, we all come to grief in different ways, and we all process grief in different ways. And so we're wandering around, and there's a park ranger, and there's a bunch of people sitting in chairs outdoors. And what he's doing is he's telling the story of Flight 93. And then we wait, and then he does it again 2 hours later. And then he does it again 2 hours later. And he does it every day through the summer, telling the story over and over and over and over again. And when he told it the first time I heard it, he got emotional, right? And then the next time I saw him, he got emotional, but in a different way. And so there was the column. He is the guy, right? There's always the guy who, or the gal, whose job is to keep the story alive. You know, if you listen to President Trump yesterday, some of what he was saying was just not true about 9/11, what he did, and what, you know, all that kind of stuff. So you need that guy saying to people who are coming from all around Pennsylvania and around the country, okay, everybody, this is what happened. And that's, I think that's almost a sacred job, right? It'll be 20 years soon, right? And it's already been reported that people are in the military who weren't even born for 9/11. I mean, how absurd is that? But you need to be reminded, well, however you process it, this is what happened. And this guy does it day after day. I mean, hour after hour, day after day. So.
Well, I think if I can, I'll take a moment to bring the conversation to a closure. Dan started the book asking the question, looking at as many topic stories and people that are in this land with the question of what is the story, with uppercase the and story. And I'm not sure, but I think I found out what the story was by the time I got to the end. I encourage all of you, if you haven't read it, to read the last story, In the Middle of Nowhere, A Nation's Center, his final piece. If you've already read it, read it again. In part, its state line is Butte County, South Dakota. In part, it's a humorous story of small prairie towns and communities competing over who is actually at the center of the United States. And it changes hands a few times, but it then is always also a story of the pride that they take when they can declare that they are the center, that put up a flag, and they put up a plaque. And the plaque has only one word in it. It says, center, that's all. And Dan concludes with a series of reflections. I really think that is the metaphor of his book, that despite our fractured politics, despite the divisiveness, there is a center left in this country. Let me read the last few sentences, and as long as Matt is here too, on my left, there's a kind of, I think, a little homage here to all English majors, a little reference at the end that I'm sure you'll catch to William Butler Yeats. But allow me to end with Dan's final sentences. Hidden songbirds provide the only sound. Their chatter recalls the giggles of unseen munchkins. And then, in this remote, still place, there comes a strange sense of reassurance that in this time of uncertain war and near certain recession, of home foreclosures and gas at $4 a gallon, at least somewhere in this nation, the center holds. Thank you, Dan.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And thank everyone for coming, and especially Richard and the entire staff of the Pottery Studio for putting together such a hospitable and wonderful venue for us. And there still are beverages, drinks, and hors d'oeuvres if you're so inclined. Thank you very much.
Thank you.